The next step is to figure out what the width is of the website that was created in Photoshop. So we can do this somewhat easily. I'm going to select the ruler tool by going right here and choosing ruler, or I can press this keyboard shortcut. Next, I'm going to specify the edges right here. And if I hold down Shift, I can limit it to a straight line, like so. Now I'm going to go to the end, and it appears in this case that the width is 935 pixels. However, we're still going to use the 960 framework because there may be some margins involved. So let's do that now. We're going to go back to 960.js and download these assets once again. If you're not familiar with 960, be sure to go back and watch the episode on it. And I'm going to open up these two directories, and I'll turn each one side by side. And now we're going to go into the code, CSS, and we're going to copy over the necessary files. In this case, we're going to copy over the text, which is their base text file, a reset, and then the 960 framework itself. Now, if we want to do both 12 columns and 16 columns, we can choose this. However, if we want to limit it so our file size is smaller, we can use this one right here. Now I will drag those in, and we're all set. Now I'm going to reference them. First one that we're linking to is our reset. Next, we're going to reference the text.css. And finally, we're going to link to 960.12 call.css referenced right here. All right, if you'd like to self-close these, you can. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to save this, and now let's reload this in the browser and see what we have. Okay, well, because we have applied some base grid class names like container 12 and grid 10, we already have a little bit of formatting, and it's starting to look like an actual website, but we need to do a little more. The first step is let's work from top to bottom. We're going to get the header and the navigation area. So let's take a look at our PSD again for reference, and the navigation is all on one line. So let's do that now. Right here, I'm going to create a divider, and I've created a snippet. I encourage you to do the same, and we'll call this header. And we're going to take all of this information right here and place it in here. And that way I can easily browse through my style sheet. A little trick is to also use an equal sign at the beginning, and then you can search for equal header and it automatically goes there. Because otherwise, if you just searched for header, it's going to bring up every reference to header. So that's a nice little trick to know. Next, I'm going to create a divider for our navigation. And let's first start by making the list items inline. So we'll say nav li display inline, save it, and let's come back. And now we can see those are being displayed inline, but they're right underneath black and white. So why don't we float the logo to the left and float the navigation to the right? We'll try that. Float left, and navigation will float to the right. Let's try it out again. There we go. That's looking better. However, because we did float, we've learned about this, because we floated these two elements, they've collapsed, and that's what's making it look like everything is pushed up. So let's come back to our header, and let's use the overflow hidden trick to make sure it contains its floats, and that'll push this information down. The next step is I want to go ahead and add that black box in that we can see right here. So it's just black, so we can specify a big width and a large height, and it's okay because we can adjust this later. Within index.html, we called it grid2. I need a better name, and we'll probably say perhaps callout, and you can change this later depending upon what you add there. Next, I'm going to go to the banner, and I'm going to put that within a divider as well because that's something I'll probably come back to often. There we are. And next, we'll say callout, and that's going to have a background of black, and we'll give it a height of 200 pixels for the time being. And now notice it should be the exact height of the background image here. So I can see that I set it to 231, so I'm going to duplicate that as well. Okay, and now we have the height, and it looks like the width probably does need to be bigger, but we're going to come back to that. Next, I want to get the basic structure in place, so let's do the main section as well. Let's come back to Photoshop, and it's split into 3 columns. And what we decided was grid 5, grid 5, grid 2. Let's come back and ensure that that is in place. Grid 5, grid 5, grid 2. But remember that it's not showing up correctly. And the reason why these aren't taking effect is because we've used the word to, but actually we should be using the number. That makes it a little bit shorter. There we are. And now let's come back, reload, and there we are. So we've already have a basic layout. Now all we need to do is add some finesse, add some padding, and make it look a lot better. So the first thing I want to do is get this area a little bit better because grid 2 probably is too small. So let's come back and why don't we adjust it right here? and right here at the bottom. But that's going to make it too wide now because we have 5, 5, and 3 is 13, and it's going to fall on its own line. So that means this may not be perfect. We have grid 4 and grid 4, but there's no way we can get these numbers to be identical without being too low or too high. So 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 3 is 11, and that's working down here, but then this is taking up more space. Next, I find it's easier for me if I use background colors so I can really easily see the dividers in my boxes. So we'll do that right now, temporarily, at the very bottom, and we're going to say get the grid 4s, and those will have a background of red, and we're going to get our container, so that's container 12 will be green, and then finally grid 3 will be a background of orange. Now let's see, and if we reload, we can kind of easily see exactly what we're working with. So as I am doing this in real time and I don't have notes, you get to see how I would do this. The first thing I think is there should be some spacing below the banner. So let's do that now. I'm going to come back, and below the banner you can see this main section begins. So let's create a new divider for the main section. And now I'm going to say main, margin top, give it some 20 pixels worth of breathing room. There we are, that pushes that down. Next, I see that the footer has pushed up because this isn't lined up either. And now I'm going to say get a new divider for the footer, and I'm going to make sure that is clear both as well. There we go, and that's pushed down, much better. My next note is I would like some spacing below the logo as well. And we have margin right here of top and bottom of 10 pixels and left and right of 10 pixels. And I must admit, I don't remember writing that, so I might have done that as a mistake because we could just reduce that to 10 pixels even. So why don't we keep 10 pixels and then 10 pixels, and then on the bottom will be 20 pixels, and the left will leave blank because it's implied that it's 10. We reload, and now that's been pushed down. Let's refer back to our Photoshop file. I see right here that we sliced out our logo, but he does have a plus in it. So why don't we try that again? Select it, and now you see it was divided into 2 layers. So why don't we group those together? And if we want, we can merge them. I can press Command E to merge, or Control E, and then do it like we did before. Select, create a new file, save it, turn off the background, save it as a ping24, and we'll overwrite the value of logo. There we are. Reload, and now we have the plus back. Okay, that was easy. The next step is we know that there's a little too much spacing here. And the reason is this design doesn't fit perfectly into a 12-column grid as we've seen here, because if these are both set to 1/3, which was what would make sense, it doesn't line up perfectly. So maybe we need a different number of columns. Now, if we come back to the 960 framework, if you'll remember, there are multiple grids that we can use. And if I open this up again, I'll go to Code, CSS, and you see that we have 12 columns, 24 columns, and even 16 columns. So that means we need to figure out how this would fit in. If we did 16 columns, that doesn't divide evenly, so that's why it's not quite as common. So if we were to divide it into thirds, that would be more like 5 1/3. So with that in mind, why don't we switch to a 24-column grid? Because that's going to give us a lot more flexibility. And to do that, it's really easy. I'm going to open up my website, and all I do differently is drag in my 24-column grid, like so. Next, we delete the old version, and then we come back and we rewrite to 96024. And now let's look at the new classes that we have, and it's fairly similar. One difference is, because we're using a 24-column grid, it's still the exact same width, but it's a different number. I need to update this as well. So let's just save that and see how our website is looking now. And notice that all of them are much smaller, so we need to update these accordingly. Let's come back to Photoshop and let's measure. I'm going to press I to select the measuring tool. If yours does not come up, you can press Shift I a few times till it does. And I'm going to zoom in and select the width of what we have right here. And let's see what I get. Okay, so his is about 340. Let's see what we have that's really close to that within here. And I can scroll down and look at each one, and this looks about right, grid 9 or so. So let's see how we can add up to 24. We have 3, so if we had 9 plus 9 is 18. Let's add that in right now, and we'll do the bottom section, grid 9 and 9. Reload, and that's pushing those out. So 24 minus 18 equals 6. And let's see how that lines up. Grid 6. There we go, and I think that's looking a lot cleaner. So yes, when you're doing it from scratch, sometimes you have to change things up. If you decide an hour into your project that you need a different grid, then do it, because it only takes a moment or two to implement. Next, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the banner right here. Come to the top, 18 plus 6 equals 24. There we go, and now we're getting a real good looking website. All right, so I'm going to continue on. And I'm going to check the spacing here again. And if we want to verify something, you can come back to your PSD, press Z to zoom in a few clicks. Now I will press I or select the ruler, and I'm just going to measure, holding down Shift, what the distance is. And that way I can see what the margin is. And it's around 22 pixels. So we did that about right when we applied it. If we want to adjust this, so I can set it to about 22 pixels. Reload. Yeah, there we go. But now here's one problem, is at the top, the navigation section is a little too high. So why don't we reduce that down? And for now, I'm going to set padding top to 20 pixels. And what we want to do here, and we're just going to use our eye, is we want to line this up perfectly with black and white. If you need to see how it lines up in the PSD, always refer back to your PSD because you want to be as close as possible. And in this case, can you see I am right underneath black and white, and the navigation section is just a touch above that. Let's try it in here. By the way, on the Mac, I am pressing Shift Command 4, which is traditionally used to take snapshots, but it can also be used to specify widths and use as a ruler of sorts. So I need to push up my navigation to 12. There we go. Next, let's work on our navigation section. Let's see how it looks in the PSD. And it's very simple. He has gray text, and the selected one, or the highlighted one, presumably if you hover over it, is a blacker color. So if we want to figure out what the color of this is, I can choose the text tool, and I will select it. And then if I come up here, it'll automatically be set to the color of that text. In this case, it's 7E, 7E, 7E. So let's add that in right now, and we'll assume that all anchor tags are set to this color. So I'll create a new divider called miscellaneous and set the A color to that. And then a hover, he had set it to black. Reload, there we are. And when I hover over one, notice it's now black. But in his design, the current page is black. The selected page is what we call it. So you can do that trick by coming back and applying a class. And then the current page will always have a class of selected. We'll do it right now. Class equals selected. And then we can also apply the hover styling to any class of selected. Reload, and now that's received it, but when we hover over something, it does as well. Let's come back though, and notice that there is no underline, so let's remove that. Text decoration, none. And of course, I should apply that to the generic anchors, not the hover state. Reload, there we go. Next, remember how I noted that he used lowercase, and I thought that was a stylistic decision. We can make it lowercase with our CSS by doing, not on our general, because it's likely you only want that styling applied to the anchor tags within the navigation, presumably. So why don't I do nav A to limit it to only anchor tags within the navigation. And then I will specify text transform lowercase. And now that's been adjusted, and we did it all within our CSS. Hover over each one, and that's looking fine. Let's check out the padding, and it looks like the spacing I have is a bit more than he has. So we can see what the default is. Inspect element, click on each list item, and you can see the default margin left of 30. If we want to reduce this, I'm going to press the down arrow and get it more towards what he has, which is 22. Or if you want to be more specific, always bring out that ruler tool, zoom in and measure yourself. He's got 24. So we'll keep it at 24 pixels, and we will update our style sheet. So we'll go back, and that's miscellaneous styling. So list item, all list items will have margin left of 24 pixels. If I reload, okay, this is looking a lot better. Let's see about styling the buttons. If we go back to the PSD, his are very simple, but there is some nice styling there. I'm going to press Z to zoom in a few clicks. First thing I can see is it's a blackish background. So I will select right here, and that will bring up an eyedropper tool. And then I can bring it over the text, click, and that will change to the current color. So I will select that, copy it, and now I can use that as the background. But how do we target that anchor tag? We certainly don't want to apply it to all anchor tags. And if we come back, we remember that we applied a class of button. So let's do that as well. All button elements will have a background of this color. Now if I reload, there it is, but there's not enough spacing. So we should use padding for that. Let's see about how much he used. I'm going to get my helpful ruler, select it to the end, and it looks like about 6 pixels worth. 6 pixels. One more time, reload. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, obviously, the default when you hover over an anchor is black. That doesn't look good. Why don't we make it white in this case? Button, hover, color, white. There we go. That looks good. Now, it looks like he has also set the text a little bit smaller, but we can verify that. And we should do that in general. What is the default font size? I'll select the text tool, select some text, and then I'll come up right here, and now we can see the information. He's got a font of Arial, and the font size he selected is 13 pixels with a line height of 20. Let's add that in right now. We can override the text.css file that was supplied. We can add it to text.css if we want, or if you'd prefer, you can work within your layout and leave that blank. In this case, because we're within style.css most of our time, I don't want to confuse you too much. So we'll do it right here within our general, or you could also have this in a typography section. Font size, 13 pixels. Line height is going to be 20 pixels. Notice that we're just going to the Photoshop file, getting the values and transferring them over. That's all we're doing here. Reload, and now it looks a little bit different, but the line height has been increased. Next, what about the default color? That's not hard black, and it has a color of 3535. So let's specify that as well. All paragraph has a color. Now, if you want that to be the default color across the board, you could apply that to the body element, but here we're going to limit it to just paragraphs. Reload, and now that's been reduced. But what about headings? Is he keeping the same color as well? And once again, I'm going to select this text, choose the color, and it does appear that he's using black as well. If we also look here, we can see that he has a really high line height set up. But we don't want to do that within HTML, because if your heading does break onto a new line, that means every single sentence is going to have that huge spacing. So what we should do is add some padding below it instead. And it looks like he's also set the letter spacing reduced as well. So we will come back. Let's specify that H1 tags have letter spacing of -1 pixel, and we're going to set the same thing to H2s. And while we're at it, if we come back, notice that I did use H1 tags here. I think that's probably not the best choice. I'm going to reduce this to H2, and I think that'll be a little bit cleaner. And that's reduced, so we need to figure out what the exact size is and also make the text smaller. In this case, the font size is 26, so I'm going to add that in. H2, font size is 26 pixels. Also, we're going to do text transform, lowercase. There we go, that's looking very good. The next thing that I see as I'm working through this, we're eventually going to get to our banner, but at the very top, that header is really close to the top, so I think I would prefer to have a little breathing room. So we can do that right at the top. Container 24, and we'll give it a margin top. Let's start with 10. And we're mostly using our eye, but I think that's cleaner. Just a little more breathing room. Good. And next, let's add the spacing below the headers. Because notice, remember, he had a lot of room and then an underline. And what color is this underline? I'm going to zoom in really close, select the eyedropper tool by pressing I or Shift I a couple times. And if I click it, now this color has been selected, and that's what I know my divider should be set to. So let's try this out because it might take a little bit of tinkering. We'll assume that all H2 tags will receive this styling. If you want to limit it to only within the main section, you could do that as well. Border, bottom, 1 pixel, solid, this color. And what you'll see when we do this is it's right underneath, but we need to stretch that out. So if we were to set padding bottom to 30 pixels, you see that gets pushed down quite a bit. And that's why you need to come to your file and measure exactly what it needs to be. If I select right there, it is around 27. And then after it, there's some more spacing of around 15. So let's adjust this. 27. And the margin will be affected underneath the border, like so. And now if we come back, we can see that that lines up. I might have measured a little too high, so I will reduce that back down to maybe 24 or maybe 20. You can play around with it. I think that looks good though. All right, and next I want to work on this block quote. In the design, he has pretty quotes around it, and the text is much larger, and it's italic, of course. I'll select the text and see he has it set to 15 with a line height of 20. Come back to miscellaneous, block quote, and the font size is 15. The line height is 20 pixels, and we want to make sure that it is italic text. I'll save that and reload, and it appears that this is not taking effect. So let's see why. Inspect element, and we see we do have that on, but the reason it's not taking effect is because the paragraph is overriding the styling of the block quote. So if we want to target that directly, we say block quote and then maybe comma block quote P. And the reason I'm doing this is because that way we get the large font size, even if whoever adds more HTML forgets to use a paragraph tag within. So it's future-proof. Now I'll come back, reload, and there it's taking effect. Next, I would like to add these pretty quotes that you can see right here. So first step is select the color, BF, and then we're going to use CSS pseudo classes because these are stylistic. So we'll say block quote, and maybe only the block quote within the main section, because if you added a blog later, they don't want those quotes with every block quote. And with that in mind, I will take all of this out and bring it into the main section like so. Now I will make a declaration for before. Content will be, for now, a simple double quote. Let's try that out, refresh, and to see that it's working, I'll change it to just lots of letters. And now I'm seeing that it's not coming up. So that means there is a problem and we get to debug together. I'm going to remove main and let's see if it's working that way. And it is. So that means there's some problem. Shouldn't this block quote be a child of main? Well, it should. Maybe we made a mistake and this is why you validate. So we can validate or first see if we can figure it out on our own. Here's our main section. So then we have a grid 9. Then we have another grid 9. But then we have this closing div, so it looks like we accidentally closed the main section too early. So we will indent this, and now we have just done a little bit of debugging, and hopefully we fixed it. And if I reload, now it's showing up. Good. So let's change this to a double quote. And can you see that it's showing up right there? Let's style it though, and make it really big like so. So I'm going to select this text and see what he has. He has it 40 pixels tall, font size, 40 pixels, color, that shade of gray. Let's try it again. Good. I want to make the font style italic as well. And now we can see it's not quite the same as his. And we can look for pretty quotes. So I'm going to search for pretty quotes HTML. So we'll check this out. And here we have some options here. And what we need are those pretty quotes. So I will copy that and come back and paste that in here instead. And now we have a curly quote is what you would call it. And now that's looking a lot better. We need to do the same thing after it as well. So main block quote after, and we're going to switch to the closing curly quote. Next, because I don't want to duplicate, I'm going to adjust this to main block quote before, and then do the same thing after. That way I can group all of this styling into one, and I don't have to repeat myself, because that can be a big pain if I need to make adjustments, and it's also not a good practice. There we go. So let's try this again, reload, looking better. But we know that this should be put on the right, as you can see right here. So let's adjust the float, right. Reload, there we go. Let's come back and see what else we can do. The color should be different. It's not that grayish color. It looks like he's using almost black. Notice the subtlety in different colors here. So I'll set the color of all text within block quotes at the top, right here, to that value. Reload, that's looking better. And if I zoom out, I'll get a better angle, and I'm going to go back and forth. It looks like the beginning quote is right before the text. It's not on its own line, and the same thing for the closing quote, but that's not what we have. Now, the reason this is happening is because we're applying this content before the block quote, but not before the paragraph, so that's where you're getting that spacing. So one way we can fix this is to apply this before the first paragraph. If I just do this, what it's going to do is apply this content before every single paragraph. And if you have multiple paragraphs within a block quote, that's going to look really odd. So instead, I'm going to limit this to the first paragraph. And that way, this styling only gets applied. However, in this case, this is the closing. So I'm going to change that to last, and this one to first child. Get the first paragraph within the block quote and add it. And that way, it should look a lot better. Now we're not getting the styling anymore because we have to adjust it here as well, like so. Reload, and now that's looking better. But still, we need some more spacing. So you'll notice little simple things like this. You could use a background if you want, but sometimes you need to spend a little bit of time with them. In this case, I'm going to add some padding left to the text itself. Once again, we're going to limit this only to the block quotes within that main section. And if we do padding left, and let's do a big number so you can see exactly what's happening. That's pushing the text over, but it's also going to put the quote over. But watch what happens if we get the quote right here and we set the position to absolute and we push it in the top left portion of that area. What you're seeing is it's disappeared, but it hasn't disappeared. It's gone all the way to the top right here. And you've learned about this in our positioning tutorial. That's happening because we have not specified a positioning context, so it's using the body or the window as its context. We can limit this, though, by always specifying in your block quotes a position of relative. And now can you see, because we specified that, it is now limited to that section, and we are able to add that padding. Good, now we're starting to get it. Let's scroll back down, and I think that padding left is too much. Let's reduce it to 30. There we go. And I also want to push it down just a touch. So right here, rather than top, let's do top 5 pixels. And you might want to play around with it just a touch, maybe 7. Okay, so we have the left section right. The right section should be on the last line. Position absolute, bottom 0, and right 0. Now, I would presume it's not going to change, as you can see right here, and that's because it's already in the bottom right spot. So we just need to push it even lower so I can use a negative number, negative 5 pixels, and that looks a lot better, maybe 7 once again. So what we should do is test this, and test it by adding another quote right here, and if we did everything right, it should still display nicely. Reload, and there you go. You have the beginning quote at the top and the closing quote at the bottom. So it did take some trickery. You could use backgrounds if you want, but I like to use CSS whenever possible. Let's get rid of that, and now we're done with that section. Okay, and we're about ready to get onto this banner. The last thing is I want to make sure everything lines up nicely. And next, we're about to get to styling this banner right up here. But one thing is that you always want to make sure your lines are nice and clean. So we should make sure that the top of these headings, the beginning of the main section, is consistent all the way through. But it's not. Notice how the block quote is just a little taller. And even though that doesn't seem like a big deal, it actually is. So we can adjust this, and what's causing this is either margin or line height. If I hover over it, can you see that the bounding box, there's actually a good bit of spacing above the heading. Now we can see that there is no margin applied. You can go to compute it to double check. No margin applied at all. So that means it's line height. And the line height can add a little bit of spacing. If I were to set that to 1em, which is the default for a heading 2, can you see how it pushed up? And now if we want to double check that we did it right here, that should line up with the top, and can you see it does? So let's fix this. And we're gonna go up to H2 tags and make sure that we specify that the line height should be 1em. And now we've made a subtle change, but that really adds up, I promise you, and everything is lining up nicely. We'll do this side as well. That lines up. Okay, good. So now you have a good working website. We just need to do a little bit more for this lesson. You've stuck around for a really long time, so congratulations. Let's get this banner text done, do a little bit of the footer, and then we're done for today, and you can put up your feet. So let's go back to the Photoshop file, zoom out, and can you see that right now the text is white with a background? So if you ever feel overwhelmed and you think, I don't know the beginning of how to do this, one step at a time. First, we specify the color. So it's telling me right here I don't have that font installed. That's okay. But the color is set to white, and the font size is 28, and he has the letter spacing reduced ever so slightly. So we can do that right now. Let's go back to index.html, and within our banner section at the very top, this is a heading. So why don't we make that an H2? You could also experiment with making these H3 tags. You just want to create the proper hierarchy, and you may need to go back and adjust it later. For now, I'll keep them all at H2s, but then remember, it is going to receive any styling that we've already applied, as you can see right there. So now I'm thinking, why don't we come back and we're going to adjust all H2s. So I'm going to select H2, and on the Mac, I can do a quick search and replace by pressing Control-Command-G. And we're going to change all of those occurrences to H3. And then right up here, I will make just this section an H2. And that way, I'm not receiving that styling. And then I can come back here and adjust things. So now we're only targeting H3s with that text. And now these will stay the same, but this is reduced to whatever is set by default. We'll scroll down a little bit more and see if there's anything else we need to change. And while I'm thinking of it, let's go ahead and get rid of those background colors that we set right here, because we don't need those anymore. We know what we're doing. Okay, so now let's specify the colors. So within here, banner H2, the color is going to be white. The font size is set to 28 pixels. That looks a lot better. And now we know we don't want the width to be too high. As you can see here, he doesn't even have the font set to bold, and he is using a special font. So if you needed to, you could also use a custom font, or you could use a background image. It's just up to you. I like to use as much HTML as when possible, but generally you may want to use a custom font. And you can look at Font Squirrel or Google Fonts for that. So for now, we're going to specify a maximum width for this section. And we can see it's roughly around 400 pixels. So I will add that in, 400. And that means anything that exceeds that width has to drop to a new line. Next, I'm going to reduce the font weight to normal. And that means no bold, just normal font weight. The next step is this should be placed at the very bottom. So we can position it absolutely. However, remember, if we say top 0, left 0, unless we have a positioning context, that's going to be all the way up here. Let's try it out. Nope, it's right up here. I was wrong because we have positioned the container. Now I'm going to position the banner because I want to set a new positioning context. There we go. Now we specify bottom to 0. There we go. And next, he does have a little bit of spacing from the left edge. Let's see what it is. 8 pixels, and he has a background color, but it's not just any background color, it's transparent. So we need to figure out how to do that. One step at a time, left of 8 pixels. That's pushed it away. And now I'm going to try to apply a background color of black. But there's a couple of things that aren't right. The first one is it looks like there's a little bit of spacing between each line. So we may need to play around with this. First, let's try to take care of the transparent background. Rather than setting a solid color, we can use a RGB for red, green, and blue. But then there's also an optional fourth parameter that most modern browsers take advantage of these days, and that's called alpha, or transparency. If we want to specify black, you can either memorize it or go here, choose black, and then you can see RGB is 000. Alternatively, white will be the opposite at 255, 255, 255. So we'll do 0 for red, 0 for green, 0 for blue, and the alpha. So let's set it to 1, which would be fully visible, or 0.5. And that's going to be a little bit transparent. Can you see how that's come down? Next, I want to push that a little closer to the bottom. So why don't we set bottom to -10 pixels? You can always play around with this. And then if I zoom in a few clicks, that text is right up against the edge of the background. Let's give it some more breathing room all around. Padding of 8 pixels as well. There you go. That looks good. So that's looking pretty good to me. Let's come back and see what other differences there are. And one I see is the background. It seems to be unique to each one. So you can see that this last line has a background, and this middle line has a background, and this top line has a background. And there are ways to do this with what we call CSS3 gradients, but that's a little beyond your skill level. So I would recommend either stick with this, or if you have to do it, you can come here and to each line, you could wrap them within something like a span tag, and then you could apply the background transparency to each span tag. However, that's really hard when you're working with a dynamic website. So you would need to figure out the best way to do this. You could either use an image for the entire text and then use image replacement, which you've learned, or in our case, we're going to stick with this. I think it's fine for where you are at this point. The last thing I'm going to do here is if I zoom in, there's still a little too much spacing up top. So let's play with it in the browser. And if we set the padding top to 0, that's going to push it down. And the bottom, maybe we'll do the padding bottom to 0 as well. That pushes that as well. So it looks like we don't need any padding top or padding bottom like we had applied. So right here, we'll modify this to 8 pixels on the left and right, but the top and bottom will be 0. Refresh, and that looks good. Okay, so we have our header. Should the header be clickable? Absolutely. The logo should always link back to your website. At the very top right here, wrap this within an anchor tag. However, one thing you may find if you're using image replacement is that when you use the text indent, it will no longer be clickable. Let's try it. Reload, and now if I hover over it, can you see I'm still not able to click on this? Let's inspect the element and figure out why. And it's because if I load this up, you'll see that the anchor itself that you would click on has been pushed all the way off the page because we specified that when we did text indent negative 10,000 pixels essentially. So an easy way we can fix this is to apply the background to the anchor tag itself. Let's do that now. Header H1. Now we're going to say header H1A, and now apply this information right here. Bring that out, and also specify the width and height, like so. And we should probably bring the float over as well because that belongs within the anchor. All right, so if we did this right, the heading should now be clickable because the text indent is only being applied to the H1 and not the anchor. And now, if I click here, you can see that is a clickable link, and we can confirm it with that pound sign. So that's looking a lot better, but now I see that we've added an issue right here where because we're floating the anchor tag and not the H1 is still a block level element. If I were to apply a background of red, if it contained anything floated, which is right there, so we'll have to do overflow hidden, what you'll see is it will take up that entire spot at the top, as you can see right there. So let's float the heading to the left as well, and what you're going to see is it disappears, and that's because the heading is now floated and the anchor is floated as well. And overflow hidden is actually working against us in this case. So there are situations where overflow hidden isn't enough to make it contain its floats. In this case, if we remove it, it does come back and it appears to work, but then we have that issue that may or may not be an issue that the heading 1 isn't containing that anchor as well. And you can fall into some potential issues in the future, so always make sure everything is contained. So what we want to do is what's called a clear fix technique. And that is where you specify that after the anchor tag, we're going to clear everything, and that'll make it contain its float. So we'll clear, and it's a rather long list. People often copy it, and we'll set it display block. We have to specify content. We'll just do a space, and then we'll say visibility hidden. Don't worry about remembering this. And we're going to set a height of 1%. So watch what happens though. If I reload the page, can you see that that's red? And that's because it is now containing the anchor tag. Now this is called the clear fix hack, and it's so common that most frameworks include it. If we go down to the 960 at the bottom, you'll see it offers a class called clear fix so that you don't have to retype these stylings every time. Now to use it, we apply the class wherever you think it's needed. This will be fine on the H1. To finish things off, inspect element, and we get rid of the red color. We don't want that. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of any margins here. So we'll say margin bottom 0, and that pushes everything up. And now we have a clickable link, and it required a little more effort, but only because we are floating, and it's a little bit different in this situation. Most of the time, you'll be able to get away with a simple process of adding an anchor tag. So we'll go here, red, margin bottom 0. So we have a nice layout. Everything seems to be lining up quite well. What you would want to begin doing is tweaking, making sure that everything lines up. For example, it looks like we have an issue right here where there's some extra margin. We would fix that. We'd need to do the footer. We can do that really quick together if you like. The footer has a border, and it's going to be the same border as we had before. So we now specify in our footer, I'm going to search for footer, and it will have a border top of 1 pixel of that color. There we go. But notice that that border is all around. We really just want it on the top, and we do want some spacing between it as well. So I will select the ruler, select how high that is. It is about 18. And now we will overwrite this. So border top and then padding top of 18 pixels. And now you'll see that looks really good. And we're going to keep it like this for this lesson. So this has been the longest lesson of the course. In the next lesson, we're going to add some tweaks, and we're going to add one of those other pages, which will be much easier now that we have all of the styling in place.